What to do with the remains of a dictator.
Welcome to Plain English, the podcast that goes at the right speed for English language learners. Listen now and read the transcript online at plainenglish.com. Now, here's Jeff, your host for today's episode.
The Spanish Parliament officially approved a measure to exhume the remains of the dictator Francisco Franco and move them from the Valley of the Fallen monument. But that one step won't resolve the deep divisions in Spanish society over the legacy of the former dictator Francisco Franco. Hi everyone, I'm Jeff, and this is Plain English, the best podcast for practicing English. JR is the producer in Mexico, and he is in charge of the website and the translations. Today is episode 88, so you can see JR's handiwork at plainenglish.com/88. That's where you'll find the full transcript of the show and translations of the hardest words and phrases from English to a variety of languages. If you like Plain English, you'll want to click follow in Spotify or subscribe in Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. You might also sign up to get the show emails. For every episode, JR and I send out a summary email that includes links to English articles about the main topic and an explanation of one more English word or expression for each episode. If you're interested in that, just go to plainenglish.com/mail. Spain's parliament voted earlier this month to exhume the remains of Francisco Franco, the country's former dictator, fulfilling a promise that Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez made upon taking power earlier this year. Franco is buried in an elegant marble mausoleum in the Valley of the Fallen, a monument to the winning side in the Spanish Civil War that Franco himself designed and ordered built. The vote in Spain's parliament was 176 in favor and just 2 against. But in a sign of how divisive Franco's legacy still is in Spain, there were 165 abstentions. When you abstain, you decline to vote yes or no. So 165 members of the Spanish parliament decided not to vote either yes or no on this matter. The 2 members who voted no said they actually meant to abstain. So there was effectively no opposition to the measure. Francisco Franco was a general in the Spanish army and rose to power after he and a group of other army generals led a revolt against the elected government in 1936. The revolt turned into a 3-year civil war in which about 500,000 people died, among them soldiers and civilians. Franco then ruled Spain as a military dictator until his death in 1975. Under his rule, he repressed opposition, sentenced some of his opponents to forced labor in concentration camps, ordered others executed, and provided support to the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, in World War II. In later years, he pivoted and was more aligned with the Western world and was a leading anti-communist in the Cold War era. He also began to open Spain's economy to outside trade and is often credited with presiding over an improving economy in his final decades in power. Franco's is an awkward legacy and one that continues to divide Spain to this day. He is currently buried in the Basilica of the Valley of the Fallen, a large monument that officially honors those who fought and died in the Spanish Civil War. The grounds of the Valley of the Fallen are home to tens of thousands of soldiers in unmarked mass graves, mostly for those who fought on the side of Franco. The monument and the towering 500-foot cross above it were built by the forced labor of Franco's political opponents. The site attracts 250,000 people each year, many of whom hold a positive view of the ex-dictator. Their view is mostly that Franco was a benefactor of Spain, that he kept Spain officially out of World War II, and that he was responsible for economic prosperity in the years after the war. Critics say, with justification, that the Valley of the Fallen is Europe's only monument to a fascist dictator. There are no monuments to Adolf Hitler in Germany or Austria, or to Benito Mussolini in Italy. Franco had undoubtedly an abysmal record on human rights. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of his political opponents were imprisoned or killed. He governed against the liberal political and economic traditions that we now take for granted in the Western world. There is no equivalent monument to the opponents of the Franco regime. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez says he hopes that exhuming the remains of Franco and moving them away from this site will help Spain reconcile this part of its history. It would be the first step into making the monument a less one-sided place. The hope is that the Valley of the Fallen can become a place to commemorate and honor the victims of the war, a monument that doesn't celebrate the dictatorship that followed the Civil War. The Prime Minister has the support of his own Socialist Party, another left-wing party called Podemos, and some smaller parties in the Spanish government. What would be done with the remains of the dictator? A natural place would be near his wife in a cemetery near Madrid. The government wants the transfer to be done by the end of the year. I have to admit that when I was researching this article, I had to Google the question, who still supports Franco? Because I just couldn't imagine that position. But then again, I am not Spanish. I did at least find the answer to that question. I imagine some of the themes of this episode might sound familiar to some of you in Chile or Brazil, which have had military dictatorships in the last 50 years or so. I want to say hi to a couple of listeners. First, Roberto from Mexico has been with us since about episode 80. Roberto is in business consulting, just like me, and he uses English at work. He's now going back in time and listening to past episodes. He's already in the 30s. So that's dedication. It's very methodical to go one by one, very analytical, left-brained, like business consultants tend to be. That's what I would do. I would go one by one back in time, but I know others of you like to skip around by topic. The good news is the website lets you do both. You can explore the topics on the top menu or just go back in time one by one. You can always get to the next episode by using the URL for the episode number. Also want to say hi to Melanie, who's listening from Germany. She's working on perfecting her pronunciation and mastery of English expressions. All those pesky expressions we have. Melanie's got a presentation coming up at work in English, so good luck on that. And thanks to all of you for listening and sending notes. JR and I love to hear from listeners. The best way to be in touch with us is via Facebook or Twitter. The show's name is Plain English Pod on both of those. You can also join the mailing list at plainenglish.com/mail and get episode updates each Monday and Thursday. The expression I'd like to share with you today is to take something for granted. I almost skipped over it because it's so common, but I think it's one you all should know. There are two real meanings for this one. First, when you take something for granted, you don't appreciate it, usually because it's so familiar. You almost can't imagine the world without it. That's how I used it earlier. We in the Western world take for granted the democracies we live in. We sometimes don't fully appreciate how lucky we are to live in free, open societies because we almost can't imagine the world otherwise. What else do we sometimes take for granted? We sometimes take our safety and security for granted. I live in a safe part of Chicago, and I don't have to worry about crime or violence near where I live. I sometimes take my safety for granted since I've always lived in a safe neighborhood, really for my whole life. But other parts of this city struggle with crime and violence. For some people, even in my own city of Chicago, they worry about the safety of their kids when they go to school. So in light of that, I try not to take anything for granted. I try to appreciate and value what it means to live in a safe area. The opposite of taking something for granted, in this sense, is to value it and appreciate it consciously. Do you think fans of dominant sports teams like Manchester United, the New England Patriots, and the New York Yankees take their team's success for granted? Maybe those fans don't fully appreciate what it's like to root for a mediocre team for years at a time. They might take winning for granted. The other slightly different way to use this phrase is to just assume something is true without thinking hard about it. In the 2016 presidential election in the United States, Hillary Clinton had a big lead in the polls right before Election Day. I think many people took it for granted that she would win, so they didn't vote. They just assumed she would definitely win. They took it for granted. But of course she did not win, so if anyone stayed home because they took her victory for granted, they regret it now. Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget, JR and I will be in Mexico City this Saturday, so if you'd like to meet us and you're in Mexico, send JR a note to jr@plainenglish.com and we will give you the details. Hope you have a great week. See you right back here in a couple of days.